The glass doors of the 40th floor swung open, and 40 pairs of eyes turned toward the man who was about to lose everything and gain something no paycheck could ever buy. Gideon Wren stood in the center of that gleaming boardroom with a small brown teddy bear pressed against his chest like a shield, his knuckles white around its worn fur, while the woman in the red suit pointed her finger at him as if she were sentencing him to something far worse than unemployment. "Do it my way, Gideon, or get out," Renata Voss snapped, her voice slicing through the silence like glass breaking on marble. And the strangest thing happened next. Gideon didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He simply looked down at the little bear in his arms, the one he had bought that morning for his 6-year-old daughter's birthday, and he turned around and walked toward the elevator, leaving behind a career he had built for 9 years, a salary that fed his family, and a room full of people who would spend the rest of the week wondering what exactly had just happened in front of them. If stories about ordinary people choosing courage over comfort move something in you, then this is exactly the kind of story you came here for, and I would love for you to like this video, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight, share it with someone who needs a reminder that walking away can be the bravest thing a person ever does, and subscribe to Oxley Stories if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in people who refuse to bend when it matters most. Now let's go back to where it all began, because Gideon Wren was not always the kind of man who could walk out of a boardroom without looking back. 3 years earlier, Gideon had been a different person entirely, a man who still believed that if he simply worked hard enough, stayed late enough, and said yes often enough, life would eventually reward him for it. He had married young, to a woman named Callie who filled every room she entered with a kind of restless, electric warmth, and together they had a daughter they named Sadie, a little girl with her mother's laugh and her father's stubborn chin. Gideon worked as a mid-level operations manager at a logistics firm back then, nothing glamorous, but steady, and Callie taught elementary school art classes 3 streets away from their small rented house. They were not wealthy, but they were, in the quiet unremarkable way that only people who have lost it can later appreciate, happy. Then, on a Tuesday in early spring, Callie went to pick up paint supplies for her classroom and never came home. A drunk driver crossed the median on the highway just after 4 in the afternoon, and within an hour, the life Gideon had built brick by brick collapsed into a pile of paperwork, casseroles from neighbors, and a 4-year-old girl who kept asking when mommy was coming back. Grief does strange things to a person's sense of time. Gideon would later say that the 18 months following Callie's death felt simultaneously like a single unbearable afternoon and like a decade of walking through wet cement. He learned to braid hair from grainy internet videos at 2 in the morning. He learned which stuffed animals could survive a washing machine and which ones would lose an eye in the process. He learned to swallow his own devastation so that Sadie would never have to watch her father fall apart, because someone in the house needed to keep standing, and her mother no longer could. It was during this raw, unsteady period that Gideon took the job at Voss Dynamics, a fast-rising consulting and technology firm known throughout the city for its aggressive growth, and its founder, Renata Voss, a woman whose reputation preceded her into every room. Renata had built the company from nothing after a bitter and public falling out with her own father, a man who had once run a modest family business and refused, according to the stories that circulated in industry magazines, to let his daughter take it in the bold direction she wanted. Renata had left, started her own venture with borrowed money and unshakable resolve, and within a decade had built something that made her father's old company look like a footnote. But somewhere along the way, the same fire that had made her formidable had also made her merciless, and those who worked closely with her knew that Renata Voss did not tolerate hesitation, sentiment, or anything that slowed down the machine she had built. Gideon took the job because it paid nearly double what he had been earning, and because a single father raising a little girl on one income does not have the luxury of turning down opportunities out of vague unease about a boss's reputation. He told himself he would keep his head down, do excellent work, and let the results speak for him. And for the first year, that strategy worked beautifully. He was promoted twice. He earned Renata's grudging respect by delivering a supply chain restructuring plan that saved the company nearly $2 million in its first year alone. He became, in the eyes of his colleagues, the reliable one, the man you wanted running your project when the client threatened to walk and the deadline had already passed. But reliability, Gideon would learn, is a currency that companies like Voss Dynamics spend without ever intending to repay. As Sadie grew older, her needs grew more complex, not less. There were school recitals and parent-teacher conferences, a bout of pneumonia in her second year of school that kept her home for 11 days, moments when she needed her father simply to sit on the edge of her bed and remind her that even though her mother was gone, she was not, and would never be, unloved or unwatched. Gideon tried to be present for these moments while still meeting Renata's expectations, and for a long time he managed to walk that impossible tightrope through sheer exhaustion and force of will, arriving at the office before dawn so he could leave in time for school pickup, working through the hours after Sadie went to sleep instead of resting himself. The cracks began to show during a project the whole office referred to only as the Ashford account, a lucrative contract with a national retail chain that Renata considered the crown jewel of the company's expansion plans. The Ashford executives wanted an aggressive cost-cutting proposal, one that Gideon, after weeks of analysis, determined would require eliminating nearly 200 jobs across several distribution centers, jobs held by workers who had, in many cases, been with the company for over a decade. Gideon brought his concerns to Renata privately at first, presenting an alternative plan that would achieve nearly 90% of the cost savings through automation upgrades and restructured shift schedules rather than mass layoffs. It was not a naive plan. It was not sentimental. It was, by every metric Gideon could produce, sound business strategy that also happened not to get an entire workforce. Renata listened to his presentation in her office with her arms crossed and her expression unreadable, and when he finished, she told him it was a nice idea for a smaller, softer company, but Voss Dynamics did not build its reputation on being nice. She wanted the layoffs on the table when they presented to Ashford the following week, framed as operational efficiency, and she wanted Gideon, specifically, to be the one to deliver that recommendation, because the client trusted him and would sign off on anything with his name attached to it. Gideon left that meeting with a knot in his stomach that would not loosen for days. He thought about Sadie that night as he sat at their small kitchen table long after she had gone to sleep, staring at the presentation slides on his laptop screen, each bullet point representing a family somewhere that would soon receive the kind of phone call that upends a life the way his own life had been upended by a phone call 3 years earlier. He thought about the woman named Dolores who worked the night shift at the Ohio distribution center, a woman he had met during a site visit who had shown him a photograph of her granddaughter and told him, with quiet pride, that she was saving up to help pay for the girl's first year of college. He thought about how easily a spreadsheet could erase a person's entire plan for their family's future, reducing years of labor and hope into a single line item labeled redundant. For the first time since Callie's death, Gideon found himself furious, not at fate or at circumstance, but at a choice being placed directly in front of him, a choice about who he wanted to be as a father and as a man while his daughter was watching, even if she was only 6 and would not remember the specifics, only the shape of the men who raised her. He decided that night that he would present his alternative plan to Ashford directly, going over Renata's explicit instructions, gambling everything on the belief that if the client saw both options honestly laid out, they would choose the one that did not require destroying 200 livelihoods. The presentation to Ashford took place on a Thursday morning, and Gideon walked into that meeting with his laptop, his notes, and a controlled, steady sense of purpose that surprised even him. He presented both plans with complete transparency, laying out the cost projections side by side, and to the visible fury of the Voss Dynamics executives seated along the wall, the Ashford leadership team, after nearly an hour of pointed questions, chose Gideon's alternative proposal, calling it, in the words of their CFO, the kind of forward-thinking solution that actually respects the people doing the work. It should have been a triumph. Instead, it became the beginning of the end. Renata Voss did not confront Gideon immediately. She was, whatever else could be said of her, a strategic woman, and she waited 3 weeks, long enough for the Ashford deal to close successfully and for the story of Gideon's insubordination to calcify into something she could use. The confrontation came during a full leadership meeting, the one captured in the moment that opened this story, where Renata had gathered nearly every department head under the pretense of reviewing quarterly performance. Instead, she used the meeting to make an example of Gideon publicly, accusing him of undermining company authority, of jeopardizing client relationships through unauthorized deviation from strategy, and of setting a dangerous precedent that, if left unaddressed, would unravel the entire chain of command that kept Voss Dynamics functioning. Gideon stood in front of his colleagues, some of whom would not meet his eyes and others who watched with the particular blend of pity and relief reserved for people grateful they were not the ones being singled out, and he listened as Renata built her case against him sentence by sentence, her voice rising, her finger eventually lifting to point directly at his chest as though she could physically push the accusation into him. She told him that the company had one way of doing business, her way, and that if he could not commit to that way without question, then perhaps Voss Dynamics was Northwest longer the right place for him. She told him, in that final, cutting sentence, that he needed to do it her way or get out, and she said it with the confidence of someone who had never once, in her entire career, imagined that a person might actually choose the second option. Gideon had walked into that meeting that morning carrying a small shopping bag, inside of which was a brown teddy bear he had bought during his lunch break the day before, intended as a gift for Sadie's birthday that weekend, a small soft thing with a stitched smile that he planned to leave in his car until he drove home that evening. Somewhere during Renata's speech, without quite realizing he was doing it, he had opened the bag and pulled the bear against his chest, holding it the way a person holds onto something solid when the ground beneath them stops feeling steady, and it was in that exact posture, teddy bear against his heart, silence in the room, that he made his decision. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself point by point, though he could have, though he had every fact and figure necessary to dismantle her accusations in front of the very people she was trying to impress. He simply said, quietly enough that several people later admitted they had to strain to hear him, that he had built his career on doing what was right for the people his decisions affected, and that if the company required him to abandon that principle in order to keep his position, then he no longer wanted the position. Then he turned, walked past the long conference table, past his stunned colleagues, past the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that suddenly felt enormous and indifferent, and out through the glass doors, carrying nothing with him except a teddy bear meant for his daughter and the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of having chosen himself, and her, over everything else. The days that followed were harder than Gideon had allowed himself to imagine while he was still riding the adrenaline of that walkout. Severance was minimal, since he had technically resigned rather than been terminated, and Voss Dynamics, through its legal department, made it clear that any attempt to discuss the Ashford situation publicly would be met with swift and expensive litigation. Gideon spent the first week sending out resumes to every logistics and operations firm in the city, and the silence that answered him was its own kind of humiliation, made worse by the fact that word travels quickly in tight-knit industries, and more than one hiring manager mentioned, carefully and indirectly, that they had heard he did not take direction well. Money became a tightening fist around their small household. Gideon canceled the streaming subscriptions Sadie loved, one by one, explaining each cancellation with a lightness he did not feel, telling her they were taking a break from cartoons to read more books together instead, and Sadie, generous in the way that only small children can be, seemed to accept this without complaint, though Gideon suspected, from the careful way she sometimes patted his hand at dinner, that she understood far more than she let on. He picked up freelance consulting work where he could find it, spreadsheets and supply chain audits for companies too small to afford full-time staff, work that paid a fraction of his old salary and required him to hustle constantly for the next contract. There were nights he sat at that same kitchen table, the one where he had once decided to defy Renata Voss, and wondered whether principal was a luxury he could actually afford as a single father with a daughter who needed shoes that fit and dental checkups and, eventually, braces. It was during this uncertain stretch, nearly 4 months after he walked out of Voss Dynamics, that Gideon received a phone call from a man named Walter Higgins, a semi-retired logistics consultant who had mentored Gideon briefly during his very first job out of college. Walter had heard, through the industry grapevine that seems to reach everywhere eventually, about what had happened at the Ashford meeting, and rather than viewing Gideon's walkout as a professional misstep, Walter saw it as exactly the kind of character reference no resume could ever capture. Walter was consulting for a mid-sized manufacturing company called Ferris Brothers that was searching for someone to rebuild their entire distribution strategy after years of stagnation, and he told Gideon, over a lunch that Gideon almost couldn't afford the gas money to attend, that the owners of Ferris Brothers were old-fashioned people who valued loyalty over ruthlessness, and that they needed someone who would tell them the truth even when it was inconvenient. The interview process at Ferris Brothers felt entirely different from anything Gideon had experienced at Voss Dynamics. The owners, two brothers in their 60s named Owen and Patrick Ferris who had inherited the company from their own father, asked Gideon directly about the Ashford situation during his first meeting, and rather than treating his answer as a liability to manage, they leaned forward, genuinely curious, and asked what had gone through his mind in that final moment before he walked out. Gideon told them the truth, that he had thought about a woman named Dolores and her granddaughter's college fund, and that he had thought about his own daughter watching him someday, wondering what kind of man her father had been when nobody with real power was forcing him to be good. Owen Ferris, the elder brother, had nodded slowly at that and said that was precisely the kind of thinking their company needed more of, and 2 weeks later, Gideon was offered the position of Director of Operations, at a salary nearly matching what he had earned at Voss Dynamics, with the explicit understanding that his job would never require him to choose between doing right and keeping his position. The transition was not instantly triumphant, because real life rarely arranges itself into a clean, satisfying narrative arc. Gideon spent his first several months at Ferris Brothers proving himself all over again, learning an unfamiliar company culture, rebuilding financial stability one paycheck at a time, and slowly, carefully, allowing himself to trust that this new chapter would not collapse the way the last one had. Sadie started first grade that autumn, and Gideon made it to her first day, standing at the school gate with a handful of other parents, feeling for the first time in months that his life had settled into something resembling solid ground rather than the shifting, uncertain terrain he had been navigating since Callie's death. Meanwhile, back at Voss Dynamics, the consequences of the choice Renata Voss had made began to surface in ways that none of the executives in that boardroom could have predicted the day they watched Gideon walk out. The Ashford account, initially celebrated as a victory once Gideon's departure allowed Renata to claim full credit for the deal's success, began to unravel over the following year. Without Gideon's careful oversight and his personal relationships with the operations teams he had built during the original negotiations, the automation upgrades were implemented poorly, timelines slipped, and the very cost savings that had justified avoiding the layoffs in the first place failed to materialize as projected. Ashford's leadership, frustrated by the deteriorating execution and feeling, according to industry rumors that eventually reached Gideon through Walter, that Voss Dynamics had essentially bait and switched them once their original architect of the plan was gone, terminated the contract 18 months early, taking their considerable business to a competitor. The loss of the Ashford account triggered a cascade of scrutiny within Voss Dynamics that Renata had spent years insulating herself from. Board members who had quietly tolerated her abrasive management style as the acceptable cost of rapid growth began asking pointed questions about a pattern of talented employees leaving the company under similar circumstances, several of whom, it turned out, had also raised concerns internally before departing that were later validated by subsequent failures. An internal culture survey, conducted reluctantly at the board's insistence, revealed alarmingly low morale and a widespread fear among staff of raising honest concerns with leadership, precisely the kind of environment where the mistakes that sank the Ashford account had been allowed to happen unchecked. Nearly a year to the week after Gideon walked out of that boardroom, Renata Voss found herself sitting across from her own board of directors, facing questions about her leadership style that she had never once expected to answer, and in the quiet, humbling aftermath of that meeting, she found herself thinking, for reasons she could not entirely explain even to herself, about the men who had held a teddy bear against his chest and walked away rather than compromise on a decision he believed was right. She requested his contact information from Human Resources, information that, under normal circumstances, would have been destroyed or simply ignored, and she called him one evening in early spring, almost exactly 1 year after their final confrontation. Gideon almost didn't answer the unfamiliar number, assuming it was another sales call, but something made him pick up, and when he heard Renata's voice on the other end, quieter and less certain than he remembered it, he found himself listening rather than hanging up. She told him, without the polished confidence that had once made her seem untouchable, that Ashford had left, that the board was restructuring her authority, and that in the difficult months since his departure, she had come to understand something about leadership that she had spent her entire career refusing to see, which was that loyalty built on fear collapses the moment fear is no longer sufficient motivation, while loyalty built on respect endures long after the immediate pressure disappears. She did not ask him to come back. She seemed to understand, even as she said it, that some doors, once walked through, do not reopen in the same direction. Instead, she simply told him that she was sorry, plainly and without excuse, for the way she had treated him and likely others before him, and that she hoped, wherever his path led next, it treated him better than she had. If any part of this story has reached something in you tonight, whether it's the memory of a moment you chose integrity over comfort, or a father you know who quietly sacrificed everything for his child, or simply the hope that decency still gets rewarded even when it takes the long way around, I would be so grateful if you let this video know it moved you, because these stories only keep reaching more people when you engage with them, and every single share and comment tells me you want more stories exactly like this one. Before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something small but meaningful. In the comments below, write the word Teddy if you believe that walking away from something toxic, even when it costs you everything material, can still be the moment your life actually begins again. I read every single one, and I would love to know how many of you have been in Gideon's shoes, standing in a room, holding on to something small and soft while the ground shifted beneath your feet. Gideon Wren never returned to Voss Dynamics, and he never regretted the choice that once seemed, to nearly everyone watching that day in the boardroom, like professional suicide. 2 years after that phone call from Renata, Ferris Brothers promoted him to Vice President of Operations, a title that came with the kind of security he had once feared he'd sacrificed forever the moment he set that teddy bear against his chest and walked toward the elevator. Sadie, now 8 years old, still sleeps with that same worn bear tucked against her side every night, unaware for most of her childhood of the quiet history stitched into its fur, though Gideon has promised himself that someday, when she's old enough to understand, he will tell her the whole story, not as a lesson in defiance, but as proof that her father chose her, again and again, in every version of the decision that mattered. On the evenings when Gideon tucks Sadie into bed, straightening that same small bear against her pillow, he sometimes finds himself thinking about Dolores and her granddaughter, wondering if she ever knew how close her job had come to disappearing, or how a stranger's decision in a boardroom 4 states away had quietly protected the life she was building. He thinks, too, about the version of himself who might have stayed silent that day, who might have delivered the layoffs Renata demanded and kept his title, his salary, his comfortable illusion of security, and he understands now, with the clarity that only distance and time can provide, that the man who would have made that choice is not the father he wants Sadie to remember, and is not, in the end, the man he wants to be when no one else is watching. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone who once chose the harder, quieter path over the easy compromise, take a moment before you go to like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who needs to hear that walking away can be an act of courage rather than defeat, and subscribe to Oxley Stories so you never miss the next story about ordinary people who choose to stay true to themselves when it costs them the most. Thank you for spending this time with Gideon's story, and I'll see you in the next one.